Batman and realism, ever since really the big explosion of The Dark Knight and earlier Batman Begins, it really took to like The Dark Knight to really like went whoo, has been like a topic that's existed around the comic book fandom for a while now. It's someone that Batman particularly seems to be something that when people decide to do a realistic, dark, gritty take on comics, or when people try and make comics be these more, how could I say this, less surreal experiences for people to read, Batman's always kind of at the front row of that conversation, especially when in terms of adaptions. But he didn't always used to be that way. Today, joining me to talk about this topic and how the Caped Crusader had turned into the Dark Knight, and if that's a good thing for the character or bad, and what exactly all this big ball of realistic, gritty things entails, is my good friend from a couple episodes on the World's Finest that you can check out on this channel are still here. And if anyone remembers the ill-fated 52 Pickup podcast, me and Jake have had a long history of this, but now he will be joining me to discuss Batman, and hopefully on the regular. So yes, long-winded explanation out there. How are you, Jake?
I'm doing wonderful, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing good too. Happy to have you here. Happy to be doing content again with you.
Yeah, happy to be here. And of course, you know, talking the guy that I can't escape from, this bat-shaped monkey that's on my back, Batman. This is what we were meant to talk about. This is where we really hit our stride, I think, is when we talk about the Caped Crusader.
So just like diving right on in, how do you feel about applying a more realistic tone to Batman, just in general?
So, like, in general, I feel like Batman is a character that works really under, like, both sides of the spectrum, because, like, some of the best Batman I've ever read has been the really surreal Grant Morrison stuff. Some of the Denny O'Neil stuff was a little more surreal, like the Norm Breyfogle stuff, too. But then on the flip side, like, the realistic Batman, you know, the Frank Miller and all that kind of stuff, that's also really good. So Batman as a character is interesting because he works, you know, painted in both lights. And I don't really have one that I prefer. Like I said, as long as it's good writing and it's a good enough take on Batman, it doesn't really have to be realistic or not realistic. I just want like good Batman content.
So it's more like the execution is what matters rather than the general tone itself.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. You know, and I think that's the same with anything. But if you present Batman in a way that, you know, he's this mythic, you know, dark, you know, like bat god creature, that can work. But also if he's a detective that is solving simple crimes throughout the city, that also works well. You know, we've seen even a guy as recent as like Scott Snyder has taken it. You know, he literally made a whole multiverse of Batman, and that worked extremely well. But then when he started his Batman run, it was these small detective stories about, you know, Gotham and the heart of Gotham City, and they were both really good. You know, I feel like Snyder's a good person to talk about when we talk about this kind of stuff, because his run was bookended by the polar ends of this spectrum, you know, and I think these bookends are really where he's done his best work. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Well, for me, I feel like Batman as a concept is in any superhero really is inherently this kind of you have to suspend your belief just a tad, at least on the basic idea of they would dress like this or have this specific moniker. Batman particularly has done a very good job of trying to justify that, specifically in interpretations dating back to even the earliest Bill Finger stories. He dresses that way to inspire fear in criminals. And although he is drawn in many different multitude of ways, some being lighter, some being darker, when an artist or a director manages to convey Batman's costume in a way when it's in all shadow and standing in front of someone, you can believably wink and nudge a little bit that, okay, yes, that would be frightening. I can see the logic behind that. But then you get into things like And I feel like people forget this. Like, even the most realistic Batman interpretations have to deal with this. The moment he starts throwing batarangs, for me, is when you have to, okay, this isn't ever going to be something a real person would ever do, because they're not going to make logos of their insignia. The reason why that exists is because DC Comics likes to make toys, and that looks a cool thing. Like, the Batmobile itself is just completely impractical in a city. He would never be able to get anywhere, no matter what kind of situation was happening on, like, because especially if he lives so far out the city, and he has to go to the Joker's, like, blowing up the mayor's office on the other side of town, and he's got a car to get there, yeah, the mayor's already long dead.
Well, and, like, in Gotham is essentially New York, right? Yeah. So you're telling me that at any given time, Batman can take a, like, gigantic tank into the city and just navigate it flawlessly. Like, that I feel is the one thing that we see in Batman comics that, like, doesn't make a lot of sense, because the Batmobile's almost always driving alone. Like, because the artists obviously want to spotlight their take on it, but the street's almost always empty when you see the Batmobile. Like, no, like, it's a gigantic city. There's no empty streets in gigantic cities like that.
Mm-hmm. And it's just one of those things where you can, no matter what take your Batman you're doing, even the most realistic takes, they always have the Batmobile. They always have the Batarang. Like, even if you remove Robin, even if you remove his, like, competency, so he's not, like, taking out Justice League members and, like, one-shotting criminals into streets with no trouble whatsoever, even if you bear him down to the minimum essentials, Batman still is a heightened character that would not work in the real world. Specific, I think Grant Morrison put it best, is, like, Batman would last a night, but then he'd, like, sprain his ankle trying to jump across rooftops because the human body just physically can't do that. So I do think there is an extent that you as a fan need to realize that doesn't mean you can't tell these realistic stories, and it doesn't in any way mitigate my enjoyment of them. But I'm specifically referring to the type of fan, I think we've all encountered them. This isn't like a jab at anyone, but this is just like trying to, I guess, just encourage a wider view of Batman appreciation stories, where Batman is, like, compared to every other character, is the dark and serious one that deals with the real issues that matters, and therefore they're trying to use this realistic interpretation of Batman as a jab against other characters, when Batman himself isn't probably the best example to use.
No, and I agree, because, you know, for every fan that thinks that and rightfully so, because there are times when Batman has taken on very serious issues and they've been done very well, but there are also, like, there's also a very real interpretation where Batman beats up the mentally ill every single night, and then, like, throws them into an insane asylum that functions more like a prison than it does an actual, like, mental health facility. So I you know, to the flip side of that, like, if you wanted to get hyper realistic with Batman, like, Batman is beating up someone in Two-Face that has, you know, like, multiple personality disorder and literally cannot control, you know, or has to use a physical object to control when he flips between those personalities, you know, or, you know, like, someone with Mr. Freeze, who clearly has, like, this attachment to something that may or may not actually be his wife, depending on the interpretation. Batman just, like, slugs this guy on a regular basis, and then is like, yeah, I know that you really care about this, but how about you go spend months inside of a, you know, prison cell where you'll get no help. So I feel like, you know, the issue with Batman and realism, I think when you get down to it, is the suspension of disbelief that it's a comic book, because I feel like there are people that want Batman to be realistic, but they don't also take into account that it's a comic and these are superheroes. So yeah, you know, like Morrison said, Batman would not function in the real world, but we're not operating in the real world. You know, Gotham exists in the same universe as a Kryptonian god that saves people on a regular basis in Metropolis. You know what I'm saying? Or a guy that, you know, operates in two cities because he's the fastest man alive in The Flash. So I feel like we have to kind of give some room to work with when it comes to that realism. Now, honestly, like, Batman should not be able to kick the Spectre. I don't feel like that's something that should happen, or some of these things where he's kind of overcome them just because he's Batman. I don't feel like that should always happen, but at the same time, like, one of his arch rivals is a man bat. We kind of have to give these creators some room to work with when it comes to realism.
And I feel like it's a stance that's kind of starting to shift as we've gotten more and more and more. Kind of, it's interesting to see how the culture's evolved. Because after the Dark Knight kind of erupted, there was a big demand for realistic superhero stories. I think the main thing why is because as fans, we can be very insecure about what we like. We've spent many, many years having to defend, especially comic book creators. Like Stan Lee recently passed, and one of his most agonizing things he always hated was whenever he would tell people what he worked in, what his job, especially before like the movies came out and before he got really, really big and popular to like, he would always kind of get snide looks, and it would be embarrassing for him and his wife to like talk about being a comic book creator, because it wasn't seen as literature, it was just seen as disposable mags. So this idea for realism is in a way trying to like grab the public by its shoulder and say, no, look, we're really good too, check us out. But it doesn't come from a place of enjoying what you like, it really comes from a place of insecurity. And I feel like comic book fans can be very insecure about what we like in the comics. We're starting to lose that now as it's become very, very mainstream to like superheroes. And that's why Batman's kind of had the freedom to return to his more comic book roots. You won't need to go too long back into the comic book's history, but Jake, isn't it weird that we exist in a world where not too long, like I think about a decade ago, we were in the middle of war games, and then we just recently finished an event where we had multiple versions of Batman from different multiverses attacking the Justice League. Like, those should be completely incombinable things, but yet here we are.
Yeah, no, and like, not to mention that in between that, we dealt with Batman dying, but not actually dying, going back in time and having to like exist as Batman throughout the past. And then when he comes back, we have a different creator that takes over and then writes him taking down one of his best friend, Jim Gordon's son, in, the Black Mirror. But I know that was Dick Grayson and not Bruce, but it is kind of crazy that we exist in this time frame, not in this time frame, but like in this world where, like, if you look at Batman, it's really hard to say that there should be one definitive take on him, because like we have something like No Man's Land, and that I feel like No Man's Land, I feel like, is a perfect example to look at when it comes to Batman and realism, because they put a pretty realistic spin on what would happen if an earthquake hit a major city like that. But then they also gave room for the surreal with the costume characters that existed in that city and how they would take over the city and, basically have these gigantic quadrants all to themselves. And, but they also did it realistically where Batman didn't just take down everybody, that was too big for one man to solve. But yeah, your point about insecurity was a really good point, because it's always been cool to like Batman. I feel like, even when it wasn't cool to like comics, people were still wearing Batman shirts. People were still enjoying Batman just because of the character. It's this guy, it's this dark, brooding guy that beats up criminals and has cool one-liners. It's always been cool to like Batman. But I don't feel like it's always been cool to dive into Batman, into the weirder aspects, like something like Grant Morrison's Arkham Asylum, where it's this like weird dream take on Batman's worst nightmare. I feel like that's not something you would give to someone on the street that was like, oh, nice Batman shirt. You'd be like, well, yeah, if you like Batman, here, read this. You wouldn't give that to someone. And I feel like, and I want to hear your take on this too, I feel like if you're trying to get someone into Batman, you might need to start them with the more realistic stuff compared to the more surreal stuff. Because I feel like there's an outside view of Batman that he is this realistic character. And if you handed someone something like Dark Knight's Metal or Arkham Asylum or, you know, you name it, they would kind of be turned off by it. Do you agree with me or disagree with me there?
See, I feel like it's a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm.
Because very much, no matter what the quality of the story, if you handed someone, like, I've had this previous example, is like, everyone's like default, oh, do you want to get into Superman? Read All-Star Superman. And as much as I love that story, it's my favorite comic book story of all time, not a good choice to give to the average person on the street, because
Nope.
I've had many occasions from non-comic books fans who are like, yeah, I read like the first 3 issues you gave. Who were like, I didn't know what the hell was going on, and I couldn't deal with it. And I'm like, all right, I can kind of see what you're going for. I guess it's just was desensitized to all of this. You kind of have to sometimes peel it back and see what someone who literally just knows them from like the cartoons or something knows. But for Batman, I feel like he kind of has the opposite problem. Is where I feel like it's better to challenge people's expectations of Batman, because then they get more invested. I feel like I've had many occasions where you give someone Batman Year One, right? Everyone, they don't really come back and say, oh, this was an amazing story I've ever read. It surprised me so much, because it's been so adapted and kind of framed like what Batman is now. Everyone kind of knows what it is and says, yeah, that was good. There's no like grand takeaway. What I feel like is the more interesting option is if you hand them Zero Year, which starts out very Year One-esque, but then quickly elevates.
Yeah.
And that's more compelling to me in terms of this whole take on realism, is where I feel like the best cases with Batman, and it's kind of my summation point, is that Batman as a person, just as Bruce Wayne, is a very emotional, a very psychological, and all his villains very psychically challenging characters, and they require a bit more. Then the Batman villains don't normally end with a punch up. There will be one in it, but it's normally like a psychological victory, and that requires inherently more of a realistic take to comics. And that's why I think a lot of people like say, oh, Batman's got the best rogues gallery in comics, because they're so psychological. The writers tend to have to put a little bit more effort into it, whereas I feel like because people are used to that, and they want realistic emotions from characters, I feel you can get away with more exaggerated, surreal scenarios as long as you keep the character consistent. And Batman, he's like the ultimate straight man. Batman won't change no matter what situation you put him in. He'll always have an answer. He'll always have a way out, whether he's fighting muggers or fighting Darkseid. Like, he's always the same character.
No, and that's a good point that you bring up, because, you know, you're right. If you handed someone Year One, especially nowadays, I feel like you would hand someone Year One and they would say, oh, you know, that reminded me a lot of Batman Begins. But they wouldn't, you know, realize that it's considered like one of the most prolific Batman stories, or prolific. I always say prolific instead of prolific. It's one of the most prolific Batman stories of all time. Yeah, and so maybe that does make me like change my view on that, because, you know, likewise, if you give someone, you know, even something like the recent, you know, Paul Dini, you know, Dark Knight, A True Batman Story, like that's definitely surreal, and it kind of shows Batman in a different light, and it would kind of challenge the way that people have to think about Batman. One thing I'm interested to kind of get your take on, though, is different creators and like different artists. Do you feel that like an artist's interpretation of Batman, do you feel like that has to be more realistic? Because in my mind, like, I almost cannot read any Batman story that's drawn by Kelly Jones. Like, I can't. And it's not a knock on Kelly Jones, but seeing Batman that has more muscles than there actually are in the human body, like bulging out of his suit, immediately takes me out of that story. Like, do you have a take on that?
Well, I feel like that's almost a different conversation, but
okay,
I can kind of see where you're coming from with like the aesthetic. Batman, for me, I feel like my personal preference, be it a realistic story or be it a more surreal story, I am 100% more in favor of the the cape is seen more than him himself, and he's almost always in shadow, kind of that, like, the best episodes of Batman the Animated Series or something are a good example, where like you just see the whites of the eyes and you don't see the mouth, but it's just a complete black figure, and maybe you'll see the logo. Even in realistic stories, I think that works still, because if you aren't showing the full costume, it's easier to believe. If Batman's hiding in shadows all the time and you don't really work out what figure he is, it justifies a more realistic take, because then he's the one absurd element in it, and you can kind of just like examine that on its own as, oh my god, this amazing person, this figure of the night lives in this city. How do people react to that? And then in the serial takes, it works as well. So like that Brayfogle art style, I think, is my default Batman. But if you're going for like specific, I know Earth 1 with Gary Frank is a very beautiful book, and that's like the utmost realistic take on Batman, where he can't even like grapple through the city properly.
Right.
But apart from that, no, I feel like body-wise, it really depends on artist to artist. But I think I prefer the shadowier Batman, and it can work in both settings. But yeah, overall, I feel like we've covered a great like mirage of topics. Something like this is something you could just go on forever and over on, and maybe we will like touch back on this if we see anything that like pops back up. But just in general, I thought this was really enjoyable. Jake, thank you for joining me on this.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. It's good to be back talking to you.
Definitely. And if you enjoyed listening to him talking to me, make sure to subscribe or comment what you would like to see us talk about others. Share this around as much as you can. It helps so much. And most of all, take it easy and enjoy your day or night or evening or whatever.
Have a good one.